for the finals is after the conclusion of all legal proceedings, including the rejection of mercy plea by the court and the president, this House believes that the decision to execute the convict must be ratified by a national referendum. Woohoo!
Mr. President! Yeah.
Madam Speaker, speaking for the third time in a row as opening government in the finals of the MSRMPD. Right. First, I'll talk to you about why we give up the monopoly to punish for crimes to the state in terms of what the basic duty of the state is and what the functions of punishment are. Secondarily, I'll talk to you about the unique nature of capital punishment in that it is purely retributive. It does not have a deterrence value, and the decision to kill someone is an emotional and not an impartial decision in the sense that it reflects more on society than often on the person that we choose to kill. Secondarily, about why there's been an evolution in the application of capital punishment, and thirdly, why the state simply doesn't have the absolute right to decide of who should be killed, and it does require a referendum. Then I'll talk to you about why, if you want to have blood on your hands, it's necessary that you should be able to decide whether you're going to have blood on your hands, because as we see by the standard of collective conscience that has been put forth by the judges in India when it comes to capital punishment, when it comes to punishing people in ways that we know we don't really like to do, we try to avoid the blame on ourselves as much as possible, and that's not a good thing for our society. And then, of course, about how a national referendum will work, right? So firstly, in terms of why we give the monopoly to punish for crimes to society in terms of the basic duty of the state. No, not yet, right? Firstly, we tell you that in terms of basic duty, it is to ensure that there's safety, security, there's stability, right? Why do you end up ensuring that? You want that to happen so that people can ensure that they can form associative obligations amongst each other, interact with each other properly without threat of any kind of harm happening to them, right? And they can form their own bonds, right? In order to do so, you end up deciding that, well, we think that it's best if we come together and create a collective that can ensure that we can be best placed to live in such a society, right? Which is why, for various kinds of crimes, you decide on a particular set of rules, right? When those rules get broken, you decide that, well, we as the state, as the collective of the people, because we represent us, we will decide what the appropriate kind of punishment is, right? Now, of course, there's the self-check mechanism in which we elect a number of people who will be making this kind of legislation. You have learned people who are appointed as judges who often decide how murder or who often decide how punishment would happen. But we keep a check even in terms of what we say the different functions of punishment are, right? And this is consistently seen in evolution, right? Because earlier, because of the kind of threats that you face to your being, in terms of there generally being more chaos in society, the function of punishment used to be purely retributive, right? Because you say that if I do the most shocking thing, then people are more likely to be deterred by it, right? Which is why in 16th century, 17th century, and UK, you often, no, not yet, don't harass me. In terms of you often be, sorry, no one's ever said that to you before, but still. In terms of you often be killed if you just stole a loaf of bread, right? Because the state needed to be able to enforce its authority in the most shocking and the most effective manner. But slowly, as we gradually moved out of that, our conditions have changed, right? Which is why the nature of punishment is not purely retributive anymore, or in terms of deterrence, it's also in order to reform, right? Which is why we ensure that our state institutions have become much better in terms of incarceration, how our prisons are, the kind of opportunities we give to people, how we punish them, we take that reformation into account. Consequently, right, we've reduced what we give capital punishment for over the years. Which is why when we give capital punishment right now, and this is interesting, right, capital punishment has never sought to work as a deterrence. Because what you end up really killing people for, right, when they commit acts of terrorism, when they do things such as raping children, when they do things such as mass murder, or things which are so absolutely heinous that only a very small percentage will ever commit these kind of acts in the first place, right? Therefore, their urge to do and these kind of acts, their motivations are not really going to be limited by knowing whether or not they're going to die or not, right? If you're a terrorist, you probably are willing to die in the first place, right? Killing Ajmal Kasab, I mean, he's not afraid of death, he was willing to die in the first place, right? So when you do this because you as a society believe that, well, In my society, my function is possible, because punishment, the crimes you give and what you punish for are also often society specific, right? So you say that, well, I will punish people, no, not yet. I will punish people and give them the death penalty because I believe that that is what is most appropriate for me as a society, because as a society, I take that call that there must be certain crimes that must be purely retributive in nature, regardless of deterrence, regardless of reformation, right? Which is why we tell you that when it comes to this kind of capital punishment, right, we tell you the state doesn't have absolute rights over making this kind of a decision. Because remember this, when you're punishing someone, you are punishing in the name of the people. Right, you're punishing because you believe that this will act and is something that society represents itself. But capital punishment becomes unique because of the finality of its kind of punishment, right? Because you believe that this person cannot reform. Take the case of Yaqub Memon, right? Even though he was convicted, he got 2 master's degrees while in prison. He made efforts to try and help out other inmates. He tried to help the Indian government in terms of ensuring that other individuals who were involved in the operation were caught, and he never actually was one of the operatives of the attack in itself. But we still hung him because we said that no. The reformation process simply does not work for this person, even though there might be evidence which acts to the contrary, right? So we tell you that because of this nature, what happens is that because capital punishment has remained on the books in terms of purely institutions or authority enforcing it, it is assumed that it is an impartial act. Because think of this in terms of collective conscience, right? Why would a judge, a single judge, say that I think someone should be killed because it shocks the collective conscience, I have the right to make it? Because no one wants to talk about the capital punishment. No one wants to say that I specifically have sentenced a man, his blood is on my hands. So you put it out on society as a whole. If you are putting it out on society as a whole, you as a society should be able to decide whether or not that blood should actually be on your hands. Because someone like me might feel that Yaqub Memon's death diminishes me as an Indian, diminishes me as part of society because I have not given my consent, his blood is on my hands, and I hate that fact, right? But there's no active discussion happening on those grounds, right? Because, I'm sorry.
In jury duty, we don't allow people to sit on the jury if they have an opposition to the death penalty. Why do you think, why won't you apply the same standard in your referendum?
Right, why do we end up happening this time? Because as I said, we don't really like talking about the capital punishment, right? Because when you have a referendum, in the sense, what are the things that will come out? It won't be just about the specific instances of that person's crime and his attempts of how he's done, right? You'll also talk about, well, who are the kind of people who get put on death row? Are they from low-income communities who couldn't necessarily afford a good lawyer? Or are they actually done so on the basis of proper evidence, right? Are they often being punished because this is a politically motivated move because it makes you look good in terms of your elections, or in terms of the procedure that was followed? Was the judge someone who has a history of convicting people for harshly in terms of crimes? Does it end up acting as a deterrent? These sort of questions often come out and get answered, and people begin to talk about it only when you end up ensuring that in a referendum, where you are forced to come out and vote on an issue, where the government is not, they're not forced, but the government is forced to try and tell you that you should come out and vote on an issue, is that there is likely to be any sort of decision on this account, right? We tell you that therefore it's only when you have this that you can actually have a decision on where we've reached as a society and who we want to punish for what sort of crimes, right? When do we want to create a retributive action? This debate isn't about the rightness or the wrongness of capital punishment, but really that in our evolution of society, should we reach a place where capital punishment is decided? If we decide that's the case, so be it. If we decide it's not the case, so be it. It shouldn't be up to the state. It should be the people. It should be up to the state.
Largely, we're going to be defending the idea of why we think court structures are independent and slightly distanced from the idea of the populace, and why we think that's a good thing. That's going to be our principal rebuttal. But more importantly, we're going to characterize the current mechanisms through which this society already has a stake in deciding the sort of laws which they wish to be bound by. Right? And to that extent, we think that the current status quo is far better than the sort of world they expose. But there are certain problems that we have with Nayan's case in general, right? Because what he wants to do is basically abolish the death penalty. To the extent that we want that, we don't want an ad hoc decision on the basis of one example like Yaqub Menon, but we want a general consensus amongst the people as to what they think about the idea of death penalty in itself. Because we tell you that the law with regard to this should be unbiased to a large extent, right? It shouldn't be based upon people's personal preference for this particular person who committed a crime or what they think was a mitigating circumstances in their views in this instance. To the extent that you want to make it a political issue, we'd rather that it be a long-term one, because that's when the issue at hand is discussed from a more principled and long-run and more stable stance, right? We'll argue that to you further in my speech. The second idea was that the state is this top-down entity and there's necessarily this extreme disjoint between the people and the state, right? Or to an extent that even within the organs of government, you don't have a check and the state necessarily wants to be retributive in these instances. We don't think that's entirely true, right? Because to a certain extent, you are tempered, because that's exactly why we have different levels of the judiciary out here. That's why we have certain amount of media in this instance trying to gain traction on this issue, and you do have these discussions coming out. But more importantly, the idea that somehow all of our Yaqub Memon's blood is on all of our hands. We don't think that's essentially true, because to a certain extent that disjoint, yes, we agree, does exist, right? Which means we don't blame essentially ourselves for the idea of that death. If we have a problem with that death penalty, yes, we should politically move forward through legislatures, which is the more active change, right? But it shouldn't be based upon this ad hoc instance. We tell you it's a little naive to suggest that, because even in these instances, judiciaries are in fact for great measure the most distance from us, and we think that's something that should be upheld. Why do we think independence of court structures is important? First of all, we tell you it forms the bounds of what it means to be in transgression of the law, right? And at the point of time where you think the stakeholder which is to be bound by that law, essentially on an ad hoc basis starts getting a say in that law, that defeats the purpose of minoritarian justice, which means to the extent that the state says we won't punish you even when you happen to be in the absolute minority, but you are still within the bounds of the law, the state should not equally well go ahead and say that someone should be acquitted at the point of time where they had full knowledge of the commission of that crime, at the point of time where society says that they can be forgiven on a post-active basis, right? Second of all, we tell you, you have to look at facts of law, which means a judiciary interprets a law on a fairly objective platform, not to say that it completely disregards what people have to say in this extent. We have juries, right, which are a better representation of the people in a smaller platform out here. Why? Because to a large extent, we think that juries can look at the evidence more closely and through a more tempered fashion. But we tell you that the political consensus building which often happens on referendums is often emotional in nature and does not look at those facts with the same degree of clarity that we want, and we think that's problematic, right? But more importantly, courts do consider mitigating circumstances. Why do we think they should be mostly objective? Because we tell you the law needs to be unequivocal on its stance, because the bounds shouldn't change on a basis where you think that this person shouldn't be hanged simply because he happens to be a person you agree with on the basis of nature, right? We tell you regardless, you should be willing to defend the death penalty stance, even in the worst case when you find it admonishable because you're simply against the stance of death. That never happens in the case of a referendum, right? When you only have polarized sort of discourse on this from the perspective of the particular actor involved. Why do we think society does have a stake in crime, but we don't think this should be absolute, right? We think there are principled as well as practical resources, right? Because first of all, we tell you, because at the point of time where you can control the bounds of the law by yourself, you come down the same slippery slope where you think that justice should be majoritarian in these instances, or to the extent that you have in the past decided to be bound by that contract where you say the state is something I entrust with the exercise of the law. I want to not be bound by it now simply because I don't agree at this point of time. We think that should never be the sort of justification that you apply in these instances, because that's where you give unnecessary and more importantly pernicious power to the people. But more importantly, it shouldn't be at the cost of their objectivity, right? Because we tell you that consequentially, to a large extent, there are problems with the way referenda are then carried out, right? Referenda are going to a large extent be polarized, right? You're going to have minimalist debates which are about which kind of inflate up people's egos or their political affiliations or their political motivations that they generally have. For example, if you have a discussion on the death penalty of Afzal Guru, right, that makes that issue far more political and divisive within society, where people more vote along the lines of what they think they agree with politically or on a religious or racial basis, right? We think that's problematic because you never look at defending your principle in the worst case when you are in the minority, but more importantly, that political consensus further makes you divisive within society on an issue which can be discussed from a far more tempered perspective. We tell you to the extent that as a society, you want to abolish the death penalty, and that's what Nayan is essentially arguing for. Yes, but make a principled stance on it by passing it through legislatures, a means which is available to you as the populace, right? We tell you, have a long run, like, sustainable stance, which is not that prone to rhetoric or to the specific nuances of the case, because principally you think it's admonishable at the point of time where your state engages in a regressive practice. Closing.
So don't you think courts are independent of public bias? Because we understand that individual people are incapable of zooming out from their personal biases and deciding what is good for society. But when you do a referendum, you get a clearer picture, a gauge of what society actually thinks and wants.
I think referenda, given that they are a yes or a no, do not completely represent what people think on the issue as a collective, right? Which means different people vote yes or no on different bases. But more importantly, we have like a problem with the idea that society would anyway have had that particular say, because to the extent that you say society cannot decide on its own, I think that kind of undercuts governments more than undercuts the ideas of op-eds, right? But more importantly, we tell you that to the extent that we think the law needs to be applied unequivocally, we tell you that at the point of time where you are faced with a principal situation where you want to hang a particular person, right? And you agree with him, and in another situation you're faced with a person whom you don't agree with, right? We think you should apply the same standards, because that's the marker of an actually civilized society, right? We don't want to live in this sort of society where you decide these sorts of questions through referenda, because we think certain principles and certain acts of government and state should be embedded in the collective conscience in the long run, right? And for more principled reasons, because we actually believe and espouse them, right? Not because we think they're something that we want to support only because there is a sense of agreeability. But more importantly, even from a practical perspective, right, we think the counter is far better, because referenda will be divisive in these instances. We tell you there will be egos which are inflated. We tell you to a certain extent there will be an extremism of the sort of stances that come up, because they'll be so based upon the identity of the person involved and not like as an impartial spectator judging the merits of whether or not a person should be hanged. We think these sorts of matters should be far more permanent. We are very happy to.
Madam Speaker, let's get one thing clear. This debate is not about whether or not we support the death penalty or want to abolish it. Right? It's about living in a state where the death penalty is an appropriate punishment to be meted out in the rarest of the rare cases to convicts, whether or not the people by means of a referendum should be a part of this conviction. We got two ideas from side opening opposition. First, that courts are more independent and thus more impartial and thus better placed to make this decision, right? They ensure that people within the bounds of the law only will get convicted and get sentenced to death. But that's still happening, because we have to look at what stage we're allowing this referendum to occur, right? The law and all the objective decision making that has to have happened has already happened. The state has determined by means of the president rejecting the mercy petition whether or not they believe that this falls into the rarest of the rare cases, whether or not they are guilty as per the law, and in those circumstances only have they sentenced them to death. In these scenarios, you're not going to have any more people than would have ordinarily gotten sentenced to death, getting sentenced to death. The only possibility is that less people will get sentenced to death, because the people can't really make a new decision when the president has not already rejected a mercy petition, right? But we tell you this last stage after the law has been decided and after the president has rejected this petition is necessarily an emotional one. And here's where they miss the nuance from Nayan's argumentation, right? Because the decision to end another person's life is distinct from any other sort of punishment that the criminal justice system metes out, because it necessarily is a retributive one. It is purely an act of revenge, purely a desire to end another individual's life. We tell you it can't be looked at from any other perspective, because any other sort of like rational end that people believe that the death penalty can be achieved by less violent means. So if you were to argue that, say, a person is incapable of reform and so it's necessary to end his life, that end could also be served by keeping him incarcerated for the rest of his life. We also told you that deterrence really doesn't play a part in this decision-making matrix, because the people who commit these sort of crimes simply aren't going to be deterred by the threat of death or by any other punishment, right? So what we tell you is that in this case we think that this necessarily emotional and necessarily irrational decision is better taken by the people. They came and told you from side opening opposition that judges and presidents are simply better equipped to make unbiased decisions in this regard. While we've told you that it isn't an unbiased decision, we tell you in any case it isn't true, because the sort of motives that influence these politicians when they are deciding to say commute a death sentence, or in fact uphold a death sentence, are often political, because they want to seem like they're hard on crime. We tell you judges are also individuals at the end of the day, and the sort of standard that's been imposed on the judiciary for deciding upon the death penalty, which is rarest of the rare cases, is simply not an objective standard decided by certain factors that they can fit in to that standard, right? So we tell you in any case, even if they want to leave it to these seemingly impartial actors, these actors are not impartial at all. So we tell you that the nature of crimes and how they're different from other sort of offences is that they're committed against the society as a whole, right? They're not committed against particular individuals. And we tell you when the punishment being meted out for a particular crime is purely retributive, it is necessary that society must collectively demand for this retribution in order for it to be legitimate. They might come and tell you that we've already accounted for this in the current representative model, where we already have elected representatives who can then make this decision on behalf of society, right? How this occurs through like indirectly elected representatives such as the president or such as the judiciary. But we tell you that elected representatives are not necessarily representative of every single ideological position of an individual, right? Nobody ever gets elected based on their position on the death penalty. And we think that it's important to take society's particular opinion and their particular standing on this particular issue, and for this reason it is necessary to have this referendum. But what have we told you is going to be the consequence of this? People are necessarily going to be more circumspect in calling for the death of an individual when they are involved in the process, when they are responsible actors in the calling for the death of an individual, and when they feel like they will have that person's blood on their hands if they do so, right? We tell you this is necessarily a change from the sort of mob mentality that preceded this situation. Because ordinarily when you did have a heinous crime committed, you simply had the mob going out and demanding for the death of that person. But it's a lot easier to do that when it isn't you who's a part of that process, when you don't feel like you are the person who has to make that decision. We tell you that when referendums occur, there necessarily is more information in society about whatever it is that is going to be voted upon, right? That's the nature of referendums. And we think that it's important for society to be having greater discussion about the criminal justice system, more discussion around the death penalty, around the wrongness of the crime, and around whether or not this individual can be reformed, right? Because the criminal justice system is about pitting that individual accused against the rest of society, and it's important that they remain a part of this process, because the criminal justice system at the end of the day is supposed to be reflective of societal morals, societal values, and what they think is completely unforgivably wrong. And for this reason, it's simply not enough for an impartial judge sitting in their ivory tower to be deciding whether or not something is deserving of the death penalty. Because the criminal justice system is in its most perfect form supposed to be reflective of what society wants. So before I move on, I'll take one.
Yeah, given that a yes or a no streamlines the morality or the moral like compass if you apply to like vote for it, why do you think individual identity matters to people? Given that a yes or a no streamlines the choice which you anyway have to make, why will you act on an inherently individual calculus?
Okay, well, of course it streamlines the decision that you have to make. We understand that. You can only commute it or you can only uphold it. But we think that there are a lot of different factors that go into making that decision, right? Which necessarily means that these people are going to have a discussion about it. They necessarily are going to have to decide everything that goes into whether they say yes or no. And this necessarily involves them asking questions that were never before asked. Because now they feel like an important part of that process. Like they should make an informed choice. Because we think it's important that the death penalty be given the sort of importance and weight and feel like the sort of weighty decision it really is. We think people are only ever going to recognize the importance of sentencing someone to death when they are intimately involved in that process by getting to decide it, right? The reason we allow the state to take decisions, as Naya told you, on like the guilt or the punishment of individuals is because we believe that they are protecting the interests of society against individuals that threaten these interests. But once all of that decision making is done and you are making something that is that is inherently and necessarily an emotional, irrational decision based on your desire for revenge against someone who you believe has committed an unredeemable wrong against the rest of society. It is necessary that all these people's opinion be taken into account. And for all of these reasons, we are very
Ladies and gentlemen, fundamentally we want to bring one thing to the notice of the audience, right? So here is a side that actually advocates for law based on how popular a crime might be, Mr. Speaker. And we think that this is something that they've never justified in the past, and we think it has pernicious problems, especially because it links something as random as popularity to something as sad as justice, Mr. Speaker. And that is what we bring to from side opening. But before that, let's actually think about like what was valid from their case. So from what we thought was an idea that said that we are generally opposed to the death penalty because it is mostly retributive in nature, which explains the analysis as to why it targets a very low number of people. It moved on to being one about burdens, right, as to whose burden it is. We'd like to deal that with three responses. Right? Firstly, we believe that if it is such a large act and it is something that society holds largely dear, we believe that it is in the interest of state mechanisms to actually take the ultimate onus and take a decision on it. Right? So we don't like this idea of relegating this type of duty to the public, particularly because it reduces the sanctity and the necessity of such a judicial system, especially because the crime is so highly valued in nature. Right? But even apart from this, of the whole argument that when people come to the metric as to whether or not they want blood on their hands, they're going to treat life as being value neutral. We think that's the biggest lie in the history of people, right? We believe that people don't see life as being value neutral because they always see life as being colored by race, culture, religion, and the type of crime that was committed, Mr. Speaker. Which is why we believe that if a person who actually voted for the hanging of the rapist in Delhi, it is very hard for us to buy that it was a value neutral decision that wasn't influenced by things that people held on their own in their heads. Right? So we believe that the rationality argument, as they said, that it would be value neutral and there would be a certain threshold beyond which the crime should have been for the public to act is simply a farce. Why is this, Mr. Speaker? Because we believe that they believe that referenda aren't politicized, right? So they believe that like there can be no political action or mobilization when referenda come about, right? So this is what they accuse the election process to be riddled with. We believe that it is not unique to that. We think referenda also gives you an enormous scope for politicization of the masses and polarizing them on several lines, right? But before that, let's move on to the idea as to why current mechanisms don't like necessarily work according to their model, right? So they accuse judges of being people in ivory towers like Saruman the Wise, right? But we believe that that is something that is not the right representation. We think that judges are capable of being more than just like the unbiased robots. We think they also represent a wide array of choices, such as being liberal judges. We have judges from different ends of the spectrum with respect to ideologies that they follow, right? But even beyond this, we believe that this type of direct participation might often become a substitute for other methods that we currently have under status quo for us to change any or to enact any change in current scenario. Right? We believe that this might take away from the value that people place in the election procedure or the procedure of participation through political action to take up or like lead to different sorts of ideas that they want to be enacted onto society. Right? But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, why do you think that this has to be blind and faceless? Right? Because we believe that the idea that a state has taken this decision is extremely important because that gives the impression of it being an unbiased decision. Okay? So here's what we mean by this. In a case where there is going to be some amount of context and controversy behind the whole issue, and there is a clear differentiation of there being a minority on a certain issue and a majority on a certain issue, when we believe that it is the public that has decided, we believe that that acts as a bias that acts as a confirmation of biases that some sects in society might have, Mr. Speaker. Speaker. In those cases, we believe is that what is actually the reason for the politicization, which I'll get on to later on my speech. We believe that that is the unique case why we need to have the state which is viewed as the most neutral body that could exist in a state as being the actor of this particular scheme. Right? So we believe that in a case, for example, where a religious minority, when the issue is seen as an issue of religion and not necessarily of one that of an anti-state actor, we believe that that is when the answer of the entire state to this issue becomes very important, right? Because the collective decision of an entire nation against a particular cause might be the ultimate confirmation of biases that some people might have and the problems that they could face, that they are a persecuted community in society, right? We believe that this ultimate justification is coming from the fact that like the whole nation has said and has spoken in a particular manner, and that adds to the bias, right? So we believe that that can be particularly avoided when you have a neutral state which is viewed to be the most neutral body in power or in existence, and we believe that those harms are largely negated if you follow a model of opening opposition, right? Before that, I take closing.
Sir, under which paradigm do you think life is viewed as value neutral? Under the paradigm of just the law, or when people get involved with the kill switch button in their hands, when are people more likely to view life as more than just...
Mr. Speaker, I believe that that's a facet, that's exactly what I explained to you. The kill switch button's importance lies on how important I hold the cause that is being debated. Right? For example, if I'm a person who believes that irrespective of any rational argument, that this person has to be hanged if he has committed something against women in general, because I think that that's the best conception of what the crime was, then I believe that then the decision becomes particularly non-value neutral because there's an added color of biases, right? And why are these biases problematic is because they can largely be manufactured, right? Here's what we tell you, Mr. Speaker. There's a large manufacturing of mobilization of the public along polarized lines, right? So because when we think that exactly because they directly participate in this issue, there is going to be greater amount of interest created in the public's mind, right? Which is different from an election where the particular strong main idea can be diffused by a basket of ideas, but this is a directed approach that engages the public, right? When this happens, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the connotations of what this might mean to the nation becomes largely varied and could be understood in many manners, right? And we believe that people who largely take up this issue to their own political interest are going to act on this, right? Why? Because they believe that the loyalty that is accrued when the public votes on a particular issue will largely be translated to the loyalty that they have to the people who act as the bastions of this issue, right? So for example, if it's a caste-related problem and the public has voted on certain lines, we believe that that participation in seeing that the referendum that they participated in was actually a success largely leads to a kind of blind loyalty into this kind of ideologies, right? And this is the kind of blind loyalty that makes people less likely to actually criticize policies that's a better outcome that is ensured when you do things through an election, when after the election you can view it from a critical perspective. But if you're so involved with life and death and the cause at hand, with the politicization and large polarization that exists, we believe that this kind of loyalty is undying and blind, and we think that's particularly problematic because issues could go in a manner that is reflective of what is most popular or which kind of people can incite the most attention, right? So because we think that there's going to be absolutely a huge bias and this is not fair as a system and this doesn't simply work to their ends, we believe in opening up.
Mr. Speaker, let's deal with the case that came out from our opening opposition, right? We're telling you that firstly, what they have a problem with, like the idea that like first of all that the judiciary is distancing itself from this process, and that's a problem, right? We're telling you that this isn't a problem anyway, right? Because when we're trying to change a certain law, there are certain costs that the judiciary must accrue if we can show you a significant benefit to that legal process being passed, right? Which to tell you secondly, that they told us, Srijesh came and told us at the end of his speech that the cost matters at the end of the day as to what kind of a decision that you make. We are telling you that the most costly thing in today's world is life and death, right? We are telling you life and death largely supersedes any kind of social or ethical biases that you may have in society. A simple example to this would be the people who go ahead and defend terrorists and still say that there's some moral principle as to why we shouldn't go ahead and kill these terrorists, right? Because terrorists, understand this, are largely seen as someone who are opposing society at a large in general, right? And these terrorists are still defended in society, and that is why I tell you the kind of ethical and racial biases that they were talking about would exist just because someone's a Muslim and someone's like, I don't know, a Hindu, don't exist in these situations, right? But more importantly, what did they tell you? They told you that like popularity is a problem. They tell you popularity shouldn't at all be a question when you're working under a democratic situation, because understand this, that you elect your government through popular vote as well, right? And when you're placing so much power on your government to be an authority who deliberates on a lot of issues, not just the death penalty, but like how you live, what values you opt into, or like what kind of institutions and how they function, or the kind of society set down that you live in, we think that popularization in a democracy and the kind of strongman argument that they're doing is significantly problematic, right? Because we're telling you that the basis on this democracy function is popularity, which means that we tell you that like we give people the power to decide on a lot of things, but most importantly, how they want to live, right? We think that people in some situation are rational voters, right? But most importantly, right, the harm, the sanctity and the necessity of the judicial system. We're telling you that they told us that judges are chosen from like a spectrum of like all of these things, and judges also have like certain biases, which means liberal judges and like conservative judges. We're telling you, if judges have these biases, and if there's like one judge operating and they're in equal representation, which they are trying to talk about, of the people, then we're telling you, why don't we extend this right and go ahead to giving this vote to actually the people, right? Because sit down, because we're telling you that in these situations where you actually extend this right to the people, they're in some way going to move closer to the democratic spectrum or situation in general. First argument, right? Principally, why certain end decisions always need to lie with the people. We're telling you that the primary stakeholder in this debate, like they identified, is also the society, right? Which means that at some point, you need to give people the power to craft the kind of moral fiber that society is based on. Which means there's a spectrum of morality in society, right? It's more lucid in transition, which means now when you have different kind of cases coming up for the death penalty, people can subjectively choose what kind of situations in which people definitely deserve to die, and what kind of situations in which people can be given the leeway, because the last button is held by these people, right? We're telling you this also cures the problem of the largely death penalty versus against death penalty debate, where the situation is either we ban the death penalty completely, where no person goes to die, or like you anyway have the death penalty. In situations where subjective metrics are applied by people who craft their own moral fiber and tell you whether these people should die, and every person has the right to vote on these issues, we think it's significantly a better standard to set, right? But most importantly, understand.
Given that your OG characterizes these cases as being few and far apart, how do you craft a model fiber from such few instances?
Well, the idea isn't that these instances are few and like less. The idea is that the importance of this instance is life and death, right? We're telling you, even if there's one instance of life and death which largely occurs less, that is going to make a significant change in society. To the extent where you think that you can't kill a terrorist because he holds certain value to society, that's significantly problematic, right? But secondly, how the moral accountability needs to shift and the culpability of killing someone needs to trickle down to society, right? We're telling you that people in today's world largely don't understand how important their votes are, right? To the extent where people are largely seen as irresponsible voters. To the extent where you attach something like life and death and the finality of someone's life to a vote, people start understanding that your vote can actually make a difference in today's society with that kind of an issue, right? We tell you that this brings us closer to the political process in general, right? To the extent where these things may or may not get politicized doesn't matter, but to the extent where people understand how important a vote is, where you make actual contribution to that one vote, to whether human beings live or die, we think that is significantly important, where it gives, where it does all of these things, right? But most importantly, this authoritative position that the government holds over all of these things, right? We're telling you that largely the thing is, the principle behind having this kind of an insulation is that the government needs to bear the brunt of like killing these people. We're telling you this is significantly problematic precedent in, from the get-go, right? Because we're telling you that Today, when people die or when people are killed, it's largely seen as the government took the life and the government took a moral judgment call on whether like that terrorist should live or that terrorist should die. We're telling you that shouldn't be the case, right? Because people largely go ahead and don't understand the government's metrics behind taking these subjective judgment calls at the end of the day, right? We're telling you that when you give this right to the people at the end of the day, it trickles down to something, when it's something as basic as death, and it trickles down to something as basic as death, people understand that, like, you know, in these situations, you need to be more sensitized to the kind of issues that happens in these situations. But most importantly, right, when you have something as basic as death and death being debated, we think that people fail to understand that they elected the government as their proxy in some situation in the past, right? Which means that when you've already elected your government as a proxy and the government is allowed to make decisions for you at this situation, when it's something as basic as life and death, people refuse to understand that we elected them as a proxy and at this point we want them to vote for us. We think the significant dichotomy in people's heads at that point. We are very okay with curing this dichotomy, right? Because to the extent where we as a society understand that there are some decisions which, even if you elected representatives, need to be taken as a society because there's something that affects society as wholly, which is life and death. We're telling you we want to extend these rights to the people, right? Because we're telling you this is in complete unison with like how much power we give people in a democratic structure. Okay, fine. So that's it, right? So we're telling you that, like, another thing that they told you is the idea of polarized discourse, right? We're telling you polarized discourse doesn't exist in the situations because largely the debate about death penalty against death penalty is like even, right? So to the extent where you need to swing one kind of voters to the other side, you need to do something extremely like persuasive and actually make them understand why you don't deserve this death penalty. Because something that is taking a life and not taking a life is seen as something so basic, one side voters won't switch to the other side so easily. You need to do significantly well to push these voters to the other side. We think it leads to a much more better democratic.
When an act compromises institutional integrity, when it translates a burden onto the public that they can't reconcile, when it sets a very low threshold for you to instrumentalize things like nationalism and bypass the legislature, we think this is reform. From closing opposition, we bring you 3 layers of extension, right? Firstly, is this a good barometer of judging public sentiment in the first place? Secondly, whether there's a value to being judged by the court, whether we believe that when they talk about things such as life, whether the life and the dignity of the victim, that is the person who's perpetrated the crime, also matters. Is this a principle we uphold? Finally, what's the impact on discourse, whether this policy actually achieves the kind of discourse that they really want to talk about? Let's get straight into extension. Like, just notice the buttons, right? So firstly, is it a good barometer of judging public sentiment? This is where we have to understand that they've rejected the idea that there is a certain profile to the type of people who end up coming to capital punishment. I'm sorry, it's just the truth, right? Afzal Guru was like a Muslim. So was Yaqub Mehmet, which means that there are certain identities which just happen to be associated with heinous crimes that come up earlier. If a person was a rapist and he was going to be hanged, he had to come from a minority community, which means don't give me crap that his identity is never going to be played up when you're going to have discourse, because that identity tends to be a part of the discourse, right? Is it a good parameter? We tell you, usually referenda are about answering a yes or no question, which means that the desired discourse on their side is your discourse on the death penalty. I'm going to show you how that doesn't happen. The discourse is never accessible to people because you have to understand the importance of voting yes or voting no in streamlining morality, as I asked you. What's the issue with voting yes? 2 problems. A, the feeling of being complicit in the act of death, right? Often we find it morally abhorrent to take the life of another person, right? Making you directly complicit in this act makes you an actor. So their idea is of sensitization. Except sensitization is likely to be compromised at the point at which you feel morally reprehensible having upheld that act, which is why we asked them, do you uphold the death penalty in the first place? Yeah, we do. Whose decision do we want to take in mind? These people. Do they want to make it? Obviously not. Complicit. Which means this is one of the decision metrics you have to understand. Which means this idea of being complicit doesn't lead to discourse they want. Right? But let's move on where you vote yes even if you get over this idea of being complicit, you happen to vote yes. Right? You have to rationalize overcoming this latent fear or this latent desire not to engage with this. And what does this lead to? You seek a certain amount of legitimacy. No, right? Because this has created a dichotomy in your head, and it is about the way you view yourself as a person having voted yes. How do people instrumentalize? They appeal to your conscience, right? And the discourse starts to move towards the extremes because legitimization often doesn't clear up the idea of the death penalty was good and bad. Discourse starts to move towards legitimizing your individual calculus for voting yes, which means how it's instrumentalized is people play up ideas such as nationalism because this is a collective you'd rather buy into, right? The idea that I could focus your idea of feeling complicit and say at least you are nationalist while doing it is the only thing which is likely to legitimize. Which means if you're going to streamline the discourse, the only way to do it is move towards the extreme because that's what collectivizes people and legitimizes this. Do we want that discourse? Obviously not, because what's not being discussed is hey, the death penalty. But let's move on even further, right? Voting no now becomes something which is anti-national, which is against the idea of death, which means that you're standing up for the act. You're seen as defending terrorists. You're seen as defending rapists because not only have the courts determined he's guilty, not only is the president determined he's guilty, but they determined that his life is not a life of bleeding. But hey, you're now the public and it's in your hands. Let's say no because all these people are wrong. That's when you start to feel, am I legitimizing that act? Which means that what I prove to you is that there's a certain conflict in your mind, which is what leads to a clear absence of your ability to lead to sensitized, rational discourse on the topic at hand, which means the discourse they talk about simply isn't happening. Let's move on, right? Because I have more to talk about. What's the value of being judged by a court? Because everybody said there's a certain amount of justice, like judges are good, judges are bad, and they've gone on about all these things. More importantly, I think the judiciary is representative of the general civilized society you want to live in, the general civilized society you aspire to live in. But more importantly, we offer even the worst of worst criminals something which they wouldn't expect: dignity. What is this dignity? Dignity isn't offering you the last meal of your choice, offering you the last chance to seek God or to seek redemption in God. Why do we offer them these things? Because they're morally abhorrent people. You know why? Because we believe in upholding even their dignity. To the extent we have curtailed their rights, we still see a certain amount of a certain amount of value in upholding that dignity because that's why we are what we are as a civilized society. Do courts guarantee this? To a large extent, yes. But what happens in the case in which you have a referendum? This person's name is dragged out through the media. He has to put his fate in the hands of every single person in the country, which means his dignity is ripped to shreds simply because you can never guarantee dignity in the case where he's not being judged just for his act, he's being judged for his identity and everything else, which means even if you offer him dignity later in terms of saying, I'll let you find God, that's not dignity because dignity should always be an absolute standard. That's what courts guarantee. If the kind of discourse isn't going to guarantee a better discourse on the death penalty in the first place, removing the idea of dignity, this removes our idea of what a civilized society is. Before I go on, very quickly opening.
Yeah, I told you that the application of capital punishment is linked to the evolution of society, so it's an exception we make to general norms. However, right now we have subjective people in institutions applying subjective standards. A referendum mobilizes people to come out and sort out these conflicts and decide what society
I've already told you that this idea of mobilization against conflict isn't leading to the kind of discourse he wants, but the kind of mobilization is going to people are going to instrumentalize the means they use to mobilize these people in the first place, which means not only any actor. And this comes to my third point. What is the greater impact on discourse? When you take something straight to the people, you've fulfilled the bare minimum, right? You've taken the decision straight to the people, which means at the time at which politicians can instrumentalize this and use this as vehicles of nationalism, which they try to do anyway in terms of regulating minorities, they're more likely to view this as a way to subvert actual legislative action on these things, which means that every single subjective call we talk about never translates into greater idea of repealing the death penalty, which is something a logical progression which is seen in states such as the US, where you believe there's no way of guaranteeing dignity in the way you die painlessly, which is why they're starting to repeat it, right? Which means that discourse never goes towards legislative action simply because you're able to say that each action is subjective, and I'm going to appeal to you at every point. I'm going to give the legislature to the people, which means that it's more convenient for you to regulate these people, appeal to their inability to reconcile the yes or no, instrumentalize them, and use them to like shut out the kind of discourse that should be there. What never happens is the discourse they want. Where it never happens is the legislature, and we're incredibly proud to report.
Alright, Mr. Speaker, we're going to tackle the case on what they gave you, right? Like, they gave you very good sounding arguments, debatable and arguments, and I'm going to break them down for you. I'm going to explain to you how dignity actually works in real life, and I'm going to explain to you how their rhetoric doesn't count for anything in this debate, right? I'm going to tell you, so don't get carried away by the rhetoric that they've told you, right? But let's understand this before we get into anything, right? Morality is more black and white when you're removed, when you're from the government's procedure, right? When you're not as involved as you are under our paradigm, we think it is more black and white, it becomes more extremist, right? Now that you're actually, you have a stake, right, in the killing of a person, we think that's when you realize that morality can be grey, right? Actions of a person could be grey, they're not just black and white. People don't commit things just because they're crazy, right? So we think morality becomes more grey, it becomes understandable to the public when you do this, when our move is implemented, right? Because all of you've seen Dark Knight, right? What happens when you hand over the switches to each other, right? We think that's the kind of example we want to give you and make you understand how people understand or react to the kind of decision the state is making, right? Because what happens right now, we say that this people are allowed to get away, right? People are allowed to get away by blaming the disconnect between the government and them, right? Because we also think why the disconnect is also exacerbated. It's because these capital punishment, especially in countries like India, never becomes a voting issue, right? Which means that we're completely fine with it becoming political, right? We're happy to take on the bigger burden on site closing and tell you that we're fine with these becoming political issues, right? We're fine with life not being viewed as value neutral, right? We'll take them on this larger burden and we'll tell you why that is fine, right? Even if these people do bring in things like race, like culture not taken, we think we're happy to involve them in the decision, right? We think that when people start voting based on caste, creed, color and all these things, right? And when others see what they are doing, we think it's easier to control discourse on these issues, right? And it's easier to eradicate them completely, right? It's easier to move towards a society that is more like, which doesn't value these facets of life as much as the society does right now, right? So we think that the discourse becomes more wholesome if the issue is becoming political as over-characterized it, right? But also in terms of the argument that these are polarized arguments and you can never actually, and it's only going to be a yes or no, and you're streamlining discourse. We think streamlining happens right now when people are allowed to run away from the blame, right? Because they're allowed to pick and choose between when they want to call the government their proxy and when they don't. And this is a problem because this allows them to escape the political process, right? We think that they're more vested in the whole process, of voting, and I'll come to this, how this happens, but we think it's the system improves as a whole, right? But also, if you really believe Gaurav when he tells you that a yes or no doesn't count for shit, right? We tell you voting in democracies is basically you voting for one person, right? It is always a single vote, but it allows you to choose your own government, right? It allows you to choose in the kind of society you want to live in. It allows you to choose the legislative body, the people who are going to make laws for you, right? Which means this vote is important, and they cannot say that this one thing won't make a difference in society, right? But let's move on to what else they had, right?
If politicization doesn't lead to policy, what's the point?
Okay, and this was the link I was going to draw for you, so thank you, Gaurav. But before we get on to that, let's talk about how that case maybe 30 years ago would have won them this final, right? But we think in the age of the social media, right? In the age where going against the state isn't seen as that abhorrent, right? If all of us go on social media and express outrage when the government does something wrong, right? So we think that the ability for people to go out there and do something that may not be what the government has been doing for the past 50 years is something that's developed over time, right? We think that the gay movement happening in the US is a proof that people are ready to go up against the structures that are placed on them by the government and society as a whole, and go for the change not taken, and go and try to implement the change that they want to see, right? But also in terms of the debater and argument that they gave you, right? We want to give the person dignity. We think the prisoner would much rather have a chance at his life than dignity, right? Because we tell you that the dignity is being dragged through the mud anyway. What happened in the Nirvaya case? These people's names were thrown about in public anyway. What happened in the case, right? The person's name was thrown about in public anyway, and people were let off easy, right? People could just run away. Arey, ye to marna chahiye, yaar. We think that this not taken. We think that this choice, right, this statement won't be as easy to make in a political system, in a society where you actively have to go out and cast your vote on the issue, right? And we think that this is why it's important for this move to pass, right? But how will this move become legislative action, right? And this is where opening opposition gave us the argument when they came out and said that look, this is going to be a political issue, right? Which means that if these issues, even if they're rare, right, like once a year, that's rare enough for you. So what happens, right? What happens is these issues become the hotbed of political discussion, right? Which means that important political leaders are going to be asked their opinion on these matters, and now suddenly capital punishment and death are going to become your what's the time?
5:45.
Okay, your burden as government is not to prove a generic idea of what death means to society, but to prove why post ad hoc referendums, after all these policies have been passed, is something you vouch for and he give you the
After 2 years of debating with Sahaj, I still fail to understand what he tries to say more often than not. Let's answer this question for us, right? The burden on government, and I have no idea what he said, but the burden on government is to prove to you that this move is going to help society become more inclusive in the government, right? It helps society bring into society discuss things which aren't usually discussed in society, right? Even in conservative societies, we tell you that this change will eventually take place, right? Maybe far off, but it will happen. But how will legislative action then take place, right? We think that what happens now is that the fact that every year it's coming up and it's becoming a political issue, so people now know like right now most of us don't know what BJP thinks of capital punishment. Most of us don't know what Congress thinks of capital punishment because we don't, politicians haven't made these issues important. But at the end of the day, each one of you knows, has a very different understanding of morality and killing a person, right? As my member characterized to you, which means that now voting on these issues is going to happen. These are going to become voting issues. Governments are going to fall and stand depending on what their opinion is on these matters, or maybe not that much, but at least it will count for something, right? And if the society wants to implement a change, if it wants to move up a certain way, they're fine with that. We think this is a wholesome, more inclusive process. We think morality is now better understood by society as a whole. We think if less people die, so be it. And for all these reasons, right, we are very, very proud.
Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely abhorrent that closing government wants to trivialize dignity to human life. The idea that some of us don't respect human life is not a reason for why the courts and other bodies should be complicit in saying it's perfectly okay for us to character assassinate them, or as both opening and closing government would want to believe, that we should use human beings as tools for discussions, because that should be a pivotal way in which we generate this discussion. I'll talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, is this just? Two, what's the quality of discussion that occurs under this? So firstly, the idea of carrying out retributive justice that we spoke about is not only that the outcomes is essential, but the way that we do it is essential, right? Which is why that in enforcing the death penalty, we moved away from guillotines to electric chairs, to now we use painless syringes. Because you recognize it's not only if you're dying, but the way that you die in these cases. Which is why we told you that this particular policy is particularly, it's extremely harmful. Because what it does is it elevates this person up to life, and everybody now has to take notice of him and has to now character assassinate him, or has to talk about him in these particular poor lives. Why is this problematic? Because we tell you that it goes against the values as a society that we already hold. Gaurav tells you this in his speech. He says that before we give you the death penalty, we make sure you meet your family, we give you time to prepare for these things, because you recognize there should be dignity in death. That's impossible. They eviscerate this to the extent that that their families and them have no right to privacy under these cases. That all of the dirty linen that's possible in these cases is washed out in public. We think that isn't a fair metric by which you can decide whether people should do this. That should definitely be the standard in this debate. And that's also the standard we apply for far less things. It's the reason that we don't show images of war in these cases, because we recognize that to peddle poverty or to peddle suffering in a society that we would not want to live in, we certainly hope that's not the one we want to live in. But secondly, we tell you that the reason that we do this is because often the state can do things that other people cannot. What opening government argues to you that we will be more circumspect about this. What we tell you is often they don't have the bravery or they don't have the incentive to do what is necessary. To the extent that you want to argue that death penalty is necessary in these cases, we think it's absolutely necessary that you give it in the hands of the people who can actually carry out this act. Because all of the arguments they give you is reasons for why people aren't able to do so, because when you weigh up the balance of whether this person deserves death penalty or whether you want to go out in your life and live your life in where you have blood on your hands, most people will pick themselves and not on what's just or what's correct in these cases. If you agree that the punishment is just, you have to give it to the people who would do this. And more than that is also the response to Abhirup when he says when he says, look, people anyways are going to do this in newspapers, they're just going to say these things. We tell you that as the state, we have to be the locus point through which public opinion is formed. And we have to be the pillar to use our infrastructure to spread human dignity and to recognize that if no one will respect victim rights, we're the people that absolutely need to do so. I'll take opening if you have questions.
What objective metric have Indian presidents applied over the past decade to commute all but 3 Muslim terrorist death sentences?
It's obviously cases of these cases in these areas will always be subjective. We don't think there's an objective standard can be applied. Our problem is now that the standard is subjective. Our problem is that we don't think that you're qualified in doing so, and that by doing this in these cases, it vitiates the rights of the victim. We don't think that you guys can continue to ignore victim rights in these cases. We tell you that's also why we don't, under normal legislation, we don't allow victims to decide what their perpetrators should suffer, because we don't think that's just. We don't think that they are the right people to make this decision. So on the second question of whether of what type of discussion we have, opening government argued to you that what will happen in these cases is that we will have discussions about policies, about the standards of evidence, about the history of judges and what they've done. We think this is ridiculous. We don't think that in any cases people get their kids from reading legal reviews and reading about courts. We don't think that was ever going to happen. But to the extent that you want to argue that people are so informed and like to do this, we have no idea why you can't do this post hoc, which means let the judiciary decide this and let people form their opinion afterwards because they're so interested in reading legal reviews. But more than that, we told you that on both opening and closing, they had to show you why people were able to do this, why we could give them this right, why they were capable of handling the case. Because let's be clear, if you look at the characterization of both opening and closing, they argued to you that we should decide whether this person deserves death penalty. They spoke only about that. At no point were they able to tell you that on a case-to-case basis, people could evaluate the facts, people could decide whether or not this person deserves death or not, whether a rape, and that's why we brought to you at extension that often what's going to happen is that they're going to mobilize nationalism. They're going to mobilize, even in these cases, that are you Indian? This person has harmed so many people, this guy carried out a bomb blast, is this something that you want? And which means the people often, if they're able to vote no, won't be able to vote no simply because in these cases, it will be seen as anti-Indian. But more than that, we tell you why, and this is particularly something that Abhirup misses, why do we think this discussion crowds out any type of discussion on proper death penalty. Because we tell you that you have a limited political capital, you have limited amount of attention, and the amount of outrage that people have is often short-lived and like limited. What does that mean? When you use this outrage on deciding a referendum and picking your side, because we think that yes or no never could involve nuanced moral discussions of whether the death penalty was doing, I think this is essential because let's recognize that when the Supreme Court ever once set a precedent, it doesn't set a precedent on any case. It often sets a precedent with as little as possible complications because that can involve in the best discussion of death penalty. When you move away from discussing this particular case and you engage in a nuance of the moral discussion of death penalty is when you can understand as a society whether this is proper. We don't think this happens because we think that you spend far too much political capital on deciding this referendum or on this particular case. We think that's bad. No. Okay. But let's also understand the way that Nayan describes this. Because he says this is not only retributive, he describes this as being almost cathartic for society. And we think that this is particularly problematic because we think often people will vote in a way where this ends a chapter in their lives. When you look at Yaqub Menon, he was related to like the bomb blast, okay? And often these people will want to say this is an end of the chapter, this is the end of a painful chapter, let's kill anybody associated with it. We don't think that they are qualified and able to make that decision within these places. We think that that's particularly problematic. But moreover, he says, look, and we think that that's particularly problematic. Closing government's extension in these cases is that it acts as a watershed movement, one where we can build consensus and do discipline. That's why Gaurav tells you that often they're not going to be able to discuss the death penalty, but instead they're going to discuss the identity of that person. And that's true, because when you look at American statistics of who gets punished with death penalty, the majority of people are black people. The majority of people are often viewed in this particular way. We didn't think that if you guys on opening or closing government wanted to have any type of discussion on death penalty, that it should be on a particular cases. Because the details of that particular case skewed any possible discussion that we can have on the death penalty. We don't think the death penalty can be reduced to a yes or no. We think if you want to have discussion, you have to have a more moral, nuanced discussion, which is guided not by rhetoric of nationalism or by identity politics, but one which engages in moral debate. We're exceptionally proud to oppose.